June 4th, 1989, Spokane, Washington. After spending the evening with friends, 13-year-old Russell Evans heads home sometime after midnight. He is soon found seriously injured in the middle of the road and dies in the hospital hours later. The official ruling by police is that Russell was the victim of a random hit-and-run accident, but his parents do not feel the evidence supports this. They believe their son was attacked and murdered, and that one of Russell's friends might be concealing the truth. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we are going to be closing off 2016 in a very special fashion. Today, I will be featuring a case which was profiled on Unsolved Mysteries nearly 26 years ago, the suspicious 1989 death of 13-year-old Russell Evans. I was recently contacted by a listener named Rebecca, who happens to be related to Russell, and got in touch with me through the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. Rebecca's mother was Russell's cousin, but Rebecca never knew Russell personally since she was not born until after his death. But she would still like to uncover the truth about what happened to him. In recent months, interest in this case has been rejuvenated a bit because of a disturbing anonymous posting which showed up on Craigslist, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. Rebecca feels that this is an ideal time to get the case back into the spotlight again, especially if there's any legitimacy to the info in that Craigslist post. But before we get started, let's get our usual business out of the way. The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and 15 to 20-minute minisodes like this one. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who's feeling generous and wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with that out of the way, we shall now examine the death of Russell Evans. Our story begins in Spokane, Washington in 1989. Our central figure is 13-year-old Russell Evans, who lives with his parents John and Sue Evans, and is considered to be a very active, fun-loving, popular kid among his social circle. On the evening of June 3rd, Russell was hanging out at a local park with some of his friends when two older teenagers showed up. Trouble started when one of the teens gave their phone number to the girlfriend of one of Russell's friends, Aaron Abramson. This led to an argument between Aaron and the two teens, but when they threatened Aaron, Russell stepped in. There was some shoving and heated verbal exchanges, but given that Russell was 6'3", he was able to convince the two teens to back off and leave. However, one of them said, "You'd better watch out because maybe I'll send my homeboys on you." Anyway, Russell eventually wound up at a friend's house, and shortly after midnight, he phoned his father to let him know he was walking home. But sometime after he left, Russell became the victim of a horrible tragedy. At 1:05 a.m., a woman named Sandy Ferris was being driven home by a friend when they came across Russell's body in the middle of the road on Thorray Hill. He was still alive and conscious, but looked to be critically injured. While waiting for help to arrive, Sandy stayed with Russell and heard him calling out the words, "Brian, help me." Paramedics soon showed up and rushed Russell to the hospital. His parents were notified, and they sat anxiously in the waiting room for several hours while Russell went into surgery. But by this point, Russell's injuries were too severe to save his life, and he wound up passing away that morning. The police told John and Sue Evans that their son had likely been the victim of a random hit-and-run accident. If Russell's cause of death was a hit-and-run and no witnesses saw it, then the odds of catching whoever was responsible did not seem great. However, after obtaining copies of the police report, John and Sue began to think something else might have occurred. When they looked at the photos, they thought Russell's injuries were consistent with someone who had gotten into a physical altercation and was severely beaten, not someone who was hit by a vehicle. He had finger bruises on his face, nose, and upper arms, which seemed to indicate that someone had been holding him from behind while he was attacked, and that there were multiple people involved. Russell also had bruises on his own hands, which supported the idea that he was involved in a fight. Since Russell's shoes were found on the road 86 feet away from his body, the police and the forensic pathologist suspected that he had been struck by the vehicle so hard that it knocked him out of his shoes and caused him to fly through the air. The major problem was that the shoes' laces were torn out and lying on the road at 2 different spots, and there was also blood on one of the laces. So how does a hit and run separate a person's laces from their shoes, cause them to get blood on their shoelaces, and send them flying 86 feet away at the same time? There were also 3 separate pools of blood found on the road, but while 2 of them were in close proximity to the shoes, one of the pools was located at an altogether different spot around 50 feet away from Russell's body and over 30 feet away from his shoes. The logistics of the hit-and-run scenario just did not make any sense. The 2 sides of the road at Thornray Hill were separated by a median, and Russell was found on the side where traffic traveled downhill. And if Russell was heading home, then yes, he should have been walking downhill. But the problem was that his shoes were found at the bottom of Thornray Hill 86 feet away from him. If Russell was hit from behind and propelled out of his shoes, then the only way this scenario would work is if he was walking uphill and then struck by a vehicle traveling uphill on the wrong side of the median normally used for downhill traffic. It just didn't add up. The Evanses decided to hire their own independent pathologist, and he came to the conclusion that Russell's injuries were likely caused by a physical altercation, not from being struck by a vehicle. The most glaring piece of evidence against the hit-and-run theory was the fact that Russell had no signs of scraping on his body, which tends to happen if your body flies 86 feet through the air and lands on some pavement. The autopsy also showed that he had received a blow to the back which broke his spine and caused severe kidney bleeding, yet the location of this blow was 46 inches from the ground, far above the height where a vehicle's bumper would have struck him. In addition, there was bruising all over Russell's back to suggest that he had been the victim of repeated blows from a blunt object. John and Sue also spoke to Sandy Ferris and revisited the crime scene with her, where she shared some interesting details from that night. In addition to seeing Russell's shoes on the road, Sandy also noticed that Russell's socks were on the pavement near the pools of blood. These socks inexplicably disappeared, but police suspected they may have been tossed away in the emergency room. But needless to say, it doesn't seem likely that a hit and run could cause a person to fly out of their socks. Sandy also told Russell's parents about him calling out for someone named Brian to help him, and mentioned that when Russell was being taken away in the ambulance, she noticed a young man dressed in white shorts and a white t-shirt who was watching over the scene through some bushes on a grassy knoll before he took off. When Sandy tried to tell a policeman about this young man, she was pretty much just ignored. In fact, she also claimed that none of the officers at the scene made any attempt to ask Russell what happened to him, though paramedics would corroborate Sandy's story about seeing a young man in the bushes on the grassy knoll. Well, it turns out that Russell did have a friend named Brian Bushing, who was with him in the park on the night of his death. And Sue remembered that when she arrived at the emergency ward that night, a nurse told her that someone named Brian had just phoned to inquire about Russell's condition. Even though he was Russell's friend, it should have been way too early at this point for Brian to have known what happened to him. When John questioned Brian, he denied being at the scene, but did admit that he wore white shorts and a white t-shirt that night. But when the police questioned Brian later on, he changed his story and claimed he didn't even own white shorts and a white t-shirt. Given that Russell was involved in an altercation with 2 teens at the park that night, there was suspicion this incident might be connected to his death. However, because they knew rumors were flying around about them, both these teens volunteered to take polygraph tests. They both passed and provided alibis for the time period in which Russell was killed. But in spite of the obvious inconsistencies which pointed away from their hit-and-run theory, the police refused to change their stance. For whatever reason, they did not seem to think that Brian was the young man on the grassy knoll that night, and just wrote it off as some random curious passerby who wanted to glance at the scene. But even if there was no physical altercation, and Russell really was killed by a hit-and-run, then that doesn't change the fact that hit-and-run accidents are still a crime. If the police genuinely believed that's what happened, They showed a curious lack of initiative at trying to find the motorist who was responsible. They did not even follow the correct procedures for investigating a hit-and-run incident, as they neglected to photograph the scene, chalk-mark the spot where Russell's body was found, and just simply washed away the blood spots from the road without collecting samples. So there was no way to find out if any of that blood might have belonged to someone else besides Russell. At one point, investigators actually mentioned the possibility that Russell might have committed suicide by leaping in front of a speeding car, which is absolutely ridiculous. While it's easy to assume that Russell was killed in retribution for the altercation at the park, there are indications that trouble might have been brewing before that. One of Russell's friends claimed that on the day before his death, Russell was given a note which read, "You'd better watch your back." However, this alleged note was never found. Interestingly enough, the two teens involved in the altercation at the park had been arrested and charged with stealing and selling electronic equipment just 2 weeks before Russell's death. Even though they both passed polygraph tests, a private investigator hired by the Evans family uncovered rumors that these two suspects had bragged about taking muscle relaxants before their polygraphs, which could have influenced the results. Since they passed the tests, the police never looked too thoroughly into verifying their alibis. Russell's parents, along with many of his friends, eventually came to believe that he may have been attacked by a local youth gang and that people were keeping their mouths shut out of fear. In 1996, shortly after an article was published about the case in the Spokesman Review, offering a $5,000 reward for information, witnesses came forward to identify gang members who may have been involved in the attack. According to one witness who was a gang member at the time, he heard a suspect openly confess to backing his vehicle over Russell's body after the gang had attacked him with clubs. The suspect's fellow gang members were going to cover for him and provide him with an alibi if they were questioned by police, but that never happened. Unfortunately, investigators still continue to maintain that Russell's death was nothing more than a hit and run, and neither the police nor the local prosecutor's office seem to show any interest in pursuing these new leads. Sadly, John Evans passed away only 2 years after this development, and Sue Evans died in 2011, so they never received justice for their son's death. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, that is, until a chilling anonymous posting showed up on Craigslist on October 26, 2016. The post has since been deleted by its author, but the original text has been copied to various message boards, so it's still out there for viewing. It lists a suspect, but I've decided to refrain from using his name on the podcast. There are some things about this posting which I find questionable, so it's possible the suspect is a completely innocent person who had nothing to do with Russell's death. I'm just going to refer to him as TJ, and use the first initials of two other people referenced in this post, whom I will refer to as D and H. But if you search hard enough, you can find the original post online. Anyway, here's the original text. In 1989, Russell Evans was killed by ex-Ferris High School students. One of them told me he did it after he graduated from Ferris in 1988. This is how I was told for what happened, which killed Russell Evans. A 4-door car full with 4 18 to 20-year-old young adults. Sitting in the back seats of that car was D and the killer TJ. TJ told me they were driving down the hill and they saw a tall kid walking on the side of the road, and TJ said they just wanted to scare the kid. The car pulled up next to Russell Evans, like the Dukes of Hazzard, and grabbed a hold of Russell Evans and took off down the hill, holding Russell Evans along the side of the car. When the car took off, down the hill, holding on to Russell Evans, Russell's long legs went back and under the rear wheel of the car while Russell was being held by TJ through the back door window of the car, and Russell Evans' feet were ran over by the rear wheel. That is how Russell Evans' shoe was found at the top of the hill and how the shoe had come off from Russell Evans. At the bottom of the hill, TJ let Russell Evans go, and that is where Russell Evans had died. Remember that Russell Evans was a tall 12-year. That may be thought to be older, because of his height. TJ, a year after the Russell Evans murder, had gone to Washington's Walla Walla State Prison for around 7 years for an assault charge. TJ is the murderer, who told me he was involved, with what is said above. You can even ask TJ's girlfriend, H. I'm sure he told her. Also, if anyone would like to debate me on what I was told, then why don't you first do forensics on the 2 shoes found on the hill for tire rubber, Or do those shoes exist today in Spokane's Unsolved Murder Evidence Department? Or could it be a cover-up, because you don't see the reward poster that was on the wall inside Spokane South Hills Round Table Pizza on Regal Street? TJ showed me that framed reward poster at that pizza place after he said what happened to Russell Evans. Wow. So anyway, this posting was also shared in the comments section of Russell Evans' profile page at the official Unsolved Mysteries website, and they responded by saying they passed this information on to the authorities handling the case. But knowing how the authorities handled this case originally, I'm not sure this will lead anywhere. Now, it wasn't uncommon to see stories on Unsolved Mysteries where a young person died in what was ruled to be a suicide or an accident, but their parents believed there was foul play involved and wanted answers. Sadly, in some of these cases, it did seem that the original ruling was probably the correct one, and the parents were fighting to keep the investigation open because they had a hard time dealing with their grief and wanted answers. But this is definitely not one of those cases. There was no way Russell Evans' death was just a random hit-and-run accident. All the physical evidence totally goes against that scenario. There was clearly foul play here, and Russell's family deserved answers. Even on the unlikely chance that the police were right and Russell's death was a hit-and-run, they still should have worked a lot harder to find out who was responsible. I suspect the main reason investigators didn't look too hard into these new leads in 1996 is because Washington State had a 3-year statute of limitations for filing vehicular homicide charges at that time. If Russell's death was a hit-and-run, police were free of their responsibility to investigate the case and charge a suspect. But if it was a murder, then there would be no statute of limitations. As intriguing as that Craigslist posting is, there are things about it which don't add up to me. It mentions Russell being dragged down the hill by a car and accidentally being run over, but it makes no mention of any physical altercation, even though some of Russell's injuries seem to be defensive wounds and consistent with someone who had been in a fight. But the biggest issue is that there were no signs of scraping on Russell's body, and if he had been dragged down the hill like described in that post, you can bet there would have been massive scraping on him. So I am skeptical about that story, but I can't deny the possibility that there might be some elements of truth in there. The major wildcard in this mystery is Russell's friend, Brian Bushing, who clearly knows more than he's telling. We have Russell calling out Brian's name for help as he's lying on the road, someone named Brian phoning the hospital immediately after Russell was taken there, and Brian admitting that he wore the same clothes as the young man seen on the grassy knoll before he abruptly changed his story. Shortly after he left his friend's house to head home that night, Russell briefly crossed paths with another friend of his who said that Russell was alone. But since Russell was calling out Brian's name at the crime scene, this would seem to indicate that he believed Brian was there and could hear him, so they must have met up at some point before he was attacked at Thornray Hill. While I have my doubts that Brian had direct involvement in Russell's death, at the very least he probably witnessed the incident or knew what happened. If Russell's death is connected to the altercation at the park, it's possible those two teens may have returned with extra muscle to seek retribution. Maybe they ran into Brian first and threatened him into telling them where Russell was, which is how they tracked him down and attacked him on his route home. Brian probably feared retaliation from the perpetrators if he told the truth about what happened. Curiously, a poster with the username Chucky Brown showed up at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum in 2010 and claimed he was Brian. He denied having any involvement or knowledge about what happened to Russell, but also included this strange sentence. As for Russ calling out for Brian, well, I'll just leave that alone. Unfortunately, he did not elaborate on that, even after other posters asked follow-up questions, and Chucky Brown never posted there again. If Brian was too frightened to say anything, that is understandable because he was a young kid at the time. But I think enough time has passed that if Brian does know the full truth about Russell's death, he really needs to come forward and tell everyone what happened. So that brings us to the end of this minisode. I would very much like to thank Rebecca for suggesting I cover this case. Even though she never got to know Russell personally, I am confident that Rebecca will pick up where Russell's late parents left off and continue searching for the truth behind his senseless death. If you have any information on the unsolved death of Russell Evans, or if you can confirm the accuracy of the information presented in that recent Craigslist posting, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, Feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I need to provide a big thank you to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who is responsible for composing all of our eerie music tracks. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website. So if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So I just want to close things out by expressing my sincere gratitude to all my listeners and fans for their support, as you have all made this an amazing first year for my podcast. As we close out 2016, The Trail Went Cold has become more popular and successful than I ever could have anticipated. But I don't think we've even scratched the surface of how successful this podcast can be, and I'm sure 2017 is going to be even better. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for making this an amazing first year. I hope you all join us next week, or make that next year, as I present a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold. Thank you.